Laura Banks stood at the great window of the landing bay, looking out at the shining surface of Talos Prime. It was a massive space station that hung in the void like a giant silver ring. Bright lights blinked all over it, and long lines of ships moved in and out of the docks. The sight still amazed her, even though this was her third visit to the Galactic Council. She took a deep breath and turned back to her team. Behind her stood 4 humans, dressed in plain dark suits. 2 men, Matthew and Ethan, and 1 younger man named Daniel. Beside them was Claire, calm and sharp-eyed. They all carried nothing, no weapons, no armor, just quiet confidence. Laura knew what everyone else on the station would think of them. She could already imagine the whispers. "Where next?" she said, smoothing her jacket. "Ready, always." Matthew replied simply. His voice was quiet but steady. Ethan gave a small nod, and Claire's lips curved into the slightest of smiles. Daniel, the youngest, adjusted his sleeve nervously but said nothing. He still wasn't used to these missions. Laura made a mental note to keep him close. They walked to the gate where a tall alien with blue skin and 3 shining eyes waited. His name tag read Aaron. He wore a ceremonial robe and carried a long staff. His eyes flicked over the humans, stopping on their empty hands and plain suits. He raised a brow but did not speak. "Ambassador Banks," he said finally, inclining his head, "the council is waiting for you." "Thank you, Aaron," Laura answered. Her voice was warm but firm. She led her team through the gate and into a long hallway. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of metal. Alien guards stood every few feet, holding strange rifles and scanning every guest that passed. Other delegations were arriving at the same time. Laura saw the tall, insect-like variants clicking to each other as they marched past in glittering black armor. They carried curved blades and heavy pistols. Behind them came the Tharn, thick-bodied creatures with wide shoulders and heavy horns. Their guards wore full suits of powered armor and carried rifles. Longer than Laura's arm, One of the Tharn glanced at her group and snorted loudly. Laura ignored him. She had expected it. The humans were always an oddity here. Every species brought weapons. Every species believed it necessary. Only humans came unarmed, and yet they kept being invited back. Daniel fell a step behind, his eyes flicking nervously to the Tharn and the variants. Matthew noticed and slowed slightly to walk beside him. "Don't worry," Matthew murmured. "Just keep walking. They won't touch you." "They're staring at us," Daniel whispered back. "Of course they are," Matthew said. "Let them." They reached a wide door that opened slowly with a hiss. Beyond it lay the council chamber, a vast circular hall with a high glass ceiling. The ceiling showed the stars outside, and bright lights floated in the air, glowing. Softly, around the circle sat rows of seats, each filled with delegates of different species. The noise of conversation and movement filled the room, but it quieted a little as Laura and her team stepped inside. All eyes turned to the humans. Laura felt the weight of their stares. She kept her chin high and walked forward, her steps even and calm. Her team followed closely, their formation loose but purposeful. She could hear faint whispers now, though she couldn't understand all the languages. She knew the tone, surprise, confusion, sometimes even laughter. At the far end of the chamber stood the council president, a tall, elegant being with golden skin and long silver robes. The president gave Laura a polite nod as she approached. "Ambassador Banks," the president greeted. "Earth's delegation is welcome." "Thank you, President," Laura replied. She took her seat at the human table, placing her folder neatly in front of her. Matthew and the others stood behind her, quiet and still. A few rows over, the Tharn delegate leaned toward his aide and muttered something. The aide glanced at the humans and chuckled, covering his mouth with a clawed hand. Laura didn't react soon. More delegates arrived, filling the chamber with sound again. All around them, guards in shining armor clutched their weapons and stood at attention. Some wore helmets that hid their faces. Others carried long blades strapped to their backs. The humans stood out sharply. No helmets, no rifles, no armor. Only their calm presence. An elderly Thorn guard passed close to Laura's table. He slowed for a moment, looking Matthew up and down. The Tharn's lip curled in disdain. "Where are your weapons, human?" he growled. "Do you wish to die helpless?" Matthew met his gaze evenly. "We brought what we need." The Tharn blinked, then let out a low laugh and moved on. Laura didn't turn around, but she allowed herself the faintest smile. Soon the president struck his staff on the floor, and the hall fell silent. The session was beginning. Laura focused on the matter at hand, but she could still feel the stares on her team. To the other species, their choice was madness. She understood why. Here, weapons were a show of strength, of readiness, of power. To come without them seemed foolish, even suicidal. But Laura knew the truth. Humans did not refuse weapons because they were weak. They refused them because they were strong. Behind her, Matthew, Claire, Ethan, and Daniel stood quietly, watching the room. They saw everything, the way the guards held their rifles too tightly, the way the Tharn glanced their way more often than necessary, the way the variant blades gleamed just a little too close to nervous hands. And they were ready, even without a single weapon. The humans were ready. The first day of the council session ended late in the evening. The air inside the great chamber grew heavy as the last debate dragged on. Laura Banks kept her calm and listened carefully, but she could feel the tension growing in the room. Outside the chamber, the halls of Talos Prime were busy with movement again. Delegates walked quickly, some still talking in low voices, others silent and thoughtful. Laura stood and gathered her papers. "Let's go," she said softly. Her team followed her without a word. They walked out of the chamber and into the main corridor. The tall doors shut behind them with a quiet thud. The humans moved together, and the sound of their shoes on the polished floor was the only noise they made. But the corridor was far from quiet. Whispers began the moment they passed. Alien eyes turned to them, some wide with curiosity, some sharp. With suspicion, Laura ignored it, but she noticed everything. She noticed how the Thorn guards leaned on their rifles when she walked by. She noticed how the Varians turned their heads and hissed quietly to one another. Even the small feathered Aurelians stopped to watch Dot. Daniel felt it too. He kept his gaze low, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. He stayed close to Matthew, who walked with slow and steady steps. Matthew did not seem bothered at all. Hands stayed clasped behind her back, and Ethan's face was unreadable. Together they moved like a shadow down the long hall. At a corner, a tall alien in green robes stepped out and blocked Laura's path. He was thin and his skin shone like glass. His eyes were dark and flat. He gave her a polite bow, but his tone was sharp. "Ambassador," he said, "your unusual choice of security has been noticed." Laura stopped and faced him. "Has it?" she asked calmly. "Many wonder," he continued, "why Earth sends unarmed guards. It is unsettling to some, dangerous even. Behind Laura, Claire tilted her head slightly. Matthew's eyes narrowed, just for a moment. But Laura only smiled a little. "Tell them," she said softly, "there is no danger, unless someone gives us a reason." The alien stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "As you wish," he murmured. The humans walked on. Soon they reached the quieter residential section of the station. Here the walls glowed softly, and the floor was lined with a thin blue carpet. Doors to guest quarters opened and closed as delegates disappeared into their rooms. Laura led her team to their assigned suite and stopped at the door. Matthew stepped ahead and scanned the corridor before opening the door. Inside, the suite was simple but comfortable. Soft chairs sat near a low table. A long window looked out into space, where stars blinked faintly in the darkness. Laura sat down and let out a small breath. Daniel lingered by the window, his hands in his pockets. "They all stare at us," he said quietly. Matthew glanced at him. "Of course they do. They think we're weak," Daniel added. Claire let out a quiet laugh. "Good, let them." Laura looked up. "That's enough," she said gently. "Daniel, you're new, but you'll see soon. They don't understand us yet. That's not weakness, that's advantage." She stood again and moved to the window. Below, the lights of the station glowed like a sea of fireflies. She watched the endless ships moving to and from the docks. Her reflection in the glass was calm, but her mind was sharp and alert. A soft chime at the door made everyone turn. Ethan moved to open it. Outside stood another alien, this one short and covered in fine golden fur. It wore a badge of the Tharn. "Delegation." Its voice was polite but cold. "The Tharn envoy wishes to speak with you, Ambassador Banks. He requests a few minutes of your time in the East Hall." Laura studied the messenger's face. "All right," she said finally. "Tell him I'll come shortly." The messenger bowed and left Dot. Laura turned to her team. "Ethan, Claire, with me. Matthew, stay here with Daniel." "Understood," Matthew replied. He moved to stand beside the window, folding his arms. The East Hall was dim and quiet. Tall pillars rose to a vaulted ceiling, and small lamps cast long shadows across the floor. The Tharn envoy stood near the center, his thick arms folded over his chest. His horns gleamed faintly in the light. The second day of the Galactic Council began early. The great chamber was already full when Laura Banks and her team arrived. Sunlight from the distant star streamed through the glass ceiling, making the polished floor shine. Guards from many worlds stood at attention all around the circle, their weapons gleaming. Everyone watched as the humans entered. Laura walked calmly to her seat. Her team followed her, quiet as always. Matthew and Ethan took their usual places behind her. Claire stood just to her left. Daniel, still learning, stayed close to Matthew. The whispers had not stopped. In fact, they seemed louder today. Eyes followed them as they crossed the floor. Some of the delegates leaned in to speak to their aides, pointing at the humans. Some just stared. As soon as Laura sat down, the president struck the staff on the floor, and the session began. The topic today was a border conflict between two powerful species, the Tharn and the Verins. Their seats were on opposite sides of the circle, and both groups looked tense. The Tharn envoy, the same one who spoke to Laura the night before, stood slowly and raised his heavy voice. "We have tried," he began, "to settle this matter peacefully, but the Varians continue to cross our borders and steal our resources. We cannot allow this to continue. The Varian delegate stood quickly, clicking in anger. Your claims are lies. It is you who sent soldiers into our lands first. Their shouting grew louder. Other delegates started to murmur and shift in their seats. The president tried to calm them, but neither side listened. The Tharn guards gripped their weapons tightly. The Varian guards leaned forward, their claws resting on the hilts of their blades. Laura's eyes narrowed. She leaned back in her seat, but stayed quiet. Matthew watched the two groups closely. Claire's gaze moved to the guards on both sides. She noticed how the Thon guards moved their fingers nervously on their rifles, how the Varians slowly spread out around their envoy. Something was coming. She could feel it, and then it happened. One of the Varian guards lunged forward. A blade flashed in his hand as he charged toward the Tharn envoy. Before anyone could react, the Tharn guards jumped into action, drawing their rifles and firing. A bright shot across the chamber. Chaos exploded. The chamber erupted with shouting. Some delegates ducked under their tables. Others tried to leave. The Tharn and Varian guards clashed in the center of the room, their weapons sparking against each other. The president's voice rang out, demanding order, but no one listened. Laura stayed seated. She placed her hands flat on the table and looked straight ahead. Her face was calm, but her team was already moving. Matthew stepped in front of her, his shoulders squared. Claire moved to her right side. Ethan took a step forward and scanned the room. Daniel froze for just a second before following Matthew's lead. None of them raised a weapon because they carried none, but their movements were quick and sure. One of the Varian guards, his eyes wild, spotted Laura and ran toward her with a blade raised. Before he could get close, Matthew moved. He grabbed the guard's wrist in one hand and twisted. The blade clattered to the floor. With a swift motion, Matthew knocked the guard to his knees and pushed him away. Another Varian swung at Claire. She sidestepped smoothly, grabbed his arm, and flipped him onto his back. Her expression never changed. The Thorn guards turned their rifles toward Laura's table. Thinking she might be an easy target, Ethan moved before they could fire. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, slammed the first guard's rifle upward, and kicked the second in the chest. Both of them fell back, stunned. Daniel stayed close to Laura. When a third Varian charged at them, Daniel braced himself and blocked the attack with his forearm. Then he shoved the attacker back toward Matthew, who finished it with a single strike. The room slowly quieted. Everyone was watching now. The humans stood in a loose circle around Laura, their hands steady, their movements precise. Tharn and Varian guards lay scattered on the floor, groaning. None of them were badly hurt, but all of them were defeated. The humans had done it without weapons, without armor, without even breaking a sweat. The president stood frozen at the center of the chamber, his golden eyes wide. The other delegates stared in stunned silence. Whispers rose slowly, filling the room like a wave. Laura stood now. She looked around at the room, at the defeated guards, at the shocked faces of the Tharn and Varian envoys. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "We came here to speak," she said, "not to fight. But if you bring violence to this hall, we will not stand by." Matthew released the Varian guard he was holding and stepped back. Claire helped another to his feet before returning to her place beside Laura. Ethan straightened his jacket and folded his hands behind his back. Daniel stayed still, his chest rising and falling quickly. but his eyes steady now. The president finally found his voice. This session is suspended. All guards are to leave the chamber immediately. The remaining Tharn and Varian guards picked themselves up and backed away slowly. Their eyes stayed fixed on the humans as they left. The Tharn envoy watched Laura with a strange expression, something between anger and respect. As the chamber emptied, Laura sat down again. She opened her folder and smoothed the papers inside as if nothing had happened. Matthew stood behind her, arms crossed, his gaze still sweeping the room. Daniel leaned slightly toward Matthew and whispered, "We didn't even hurt them badly." Matthew gave a faint smile. "That's the point." Around the chamber, delegates from other worlds continued to steal glances at the humans. Some looked frightened, others looked thoughtful, but no one spoke to them. Not yet. Laura waited patiently for the president to return to the center of the room. She could feel the eyes on her back, but she didn't mind. She knew what they were thinking. They were wondering how humans could do what they did without weapons, how they moved with such confidence, how they turned the tide without firing. A shot let them wonder, she thought. Let them learn. She closed her folder and leaned back in her chair, her eyes calm as the stars above. Her team stood silently around her, ready for whatever came next. The fight in the council chamber was over, but its shadow stayed in the halls of Talos Prime. By the next morning, everyone on the station seemed to know what had happened. The humans had faced armed guards and stopped them without weapons. They had not killed anyone, but they had ended the fight faster than anyone thought possible, and they did it with calm and control. As Laura walked down the long central corridor, she could feel the change. The stairs were sharper now, but they were also filled with something else. Respect, fear, wonder. Aliens moved out of her way as she passed. Even the Tharn and Varian guards who stood at the doors avoided her eyes now. Matthew walked close behind her, his hands clasped behind his back. Claire and Ethan followed a step behind him. Daniel stayed on Laura's right side, quiet but more steady than the day before. He was learning how to move, how to stand, how to feel the room. The corridor was busy. Envoys and aides from many worlds rushed past carrying data tablets and speaking in their strange languages. But as soon as the humans appeared, the noise lowered. Voices dropped to whispers. Some stopped speaking altogether and simply watched. They reached a small rest area at the corner of the corridor. Laura sat on one of the benches and opened her folder to read. Matthew stood next to her, scanning the crowd. Daniel leaned against the wall, still catching his breath from the walk. Claire's eyes followed a group of Aurelian guards who paused nearby. They were covered in fine feathers and carried long ceremonial spears. They stared at the humans for a long moment before turning away quickly and walking on. "They keep looking at us," Daniel said softly. "Yes," Matthew replied. "They will keep looking because they don't understand." "What don't they understand?" Daniel asked. Matthew gave a small shrug. "That you don't need weapons to be dangerous." Laura glanced up from her papers and gave Matthew a faint smile before returning to her work. Just then, an aide from the Tharn delegation approached. He was tall and thin, his horns smaller than most Tharn. He held a small silver disc in his hands. When he reached Laura, he bowed slightly. "Ambassador Banks," he said in a low voice. "The Thorn envoy requests your presence this evening in the observatory hall." Laura closed her folder and looked up at him. "Very well," she said. Simply, The aide seemed nervous. His eyes darted to Matthew and then to Claire. "And he requests that you come alone." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Alone?" She repeated. "Yes," the aide said quickly. He says he wishes to speak privately." Laura studied the aide for a long moment before nodding. "Tell him I will come." The aide bowed again and hurried away. Claire watched him disappear. Into the crowd? "That sounds like a trap," Daniel said under his breath. "Of course it does," Claire replied calmly. "But she's going anyway?" he asked. Matthew looked at Laura and gave a small nod. "Of course she is." That evening, Laura left her team behind and walked alone to the observatory hall. The station was quiet now, the lights dimmed to a soft glow. The air felt cooler. Outside the tall windows, stars shone like scattered jewels. She reached the observatory and found the Tharn envoy waiting at the far end of the room. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the stars. His horns caught the light faintly. "You ask to see me," Laura said evenly. The envoy turned, slowly. The next day on Thalos Prime felt heavier than before. The air was tense, and the whispers about the humans were louder now. Everywhere Laura and her team went, eyes followed them. No one dared to speak directly, but she could feel it. Something was coming. Laura walked through the long corridors with her team close behind. Matthew was as calm as always, his hands folded behind him. Claire's eyes moved constantly, watching every shadow. Ethan stayed quiet and alert. Daniel, though still learning, walked straighter now. He was starting to understand the way things worked here. When they reached the council chamber, the president was already waiting at the center. The room was quiet, even with all the delegates inside. The usual noise of small conversations was gone. Laura noticed the Tharn envoy watching her, and beside him, the Varian envoy also stared. But today their eyes held something different. Not just fear or respect, but also a plan. The president struck the floor with his staff and called the session to order. Laura sat at her place, her folder ready, her team standing behind her. The session began with simple reports about trade and border disputes. But Laura knew this calm would not last. After an hour, the president announced a short break. As the delegates began to leave the room, Laura felt a faint vibration through the floor. She looked up just in time to see the doors at the back of the chamber slam shut. Heavy locks clicked into place. The room fell silent, suddenly, from a side. The door for tall figures entered. They wore dark armor that covered them from head to toe. Each one carried a glowing plasma blade in one hand and a long shock baton in the other. Their movements were fast and controlled. They spread out and blocked the exits. The president stepped back in surprise. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, but no one answered. Instead, the tallest of the armored figures walked toward Laura's table. His voice was deep and metallic through his helmet. "Ambassador Banks, you and your team will come with us." Matthew stepped forward at once. "On whose orders?" he asked evenly. The figure raised his blade slightly. "You will not question. You will obey." Laura stood slowly. "If this is a test," she said softly, "you will regret it." The figure did not answer. Instead, he took another step closer. The other three figures moved toward her team, weapons ready. The room stayed silent. No one moved to help the humans. Some of the delegates even backed away, as if afraid to be caught in what was about to happen. Laura gave Matthew the smallest nod. Everything happened at once. The lead figure lunged forward. aiming his blade at Laura. Before it reached her, Matthew stepped into its path. His hand shot out and grabbed the figure's wrist. With a sharp twist, he sent the blade clattering to the floor. In the same motion, he kicked the figure backward. Claire moved next. One of the armored attackers swung, his baton at her head. She ducked low, swept his legs out from under him, and sent him crashing to the floor. She stayed crouched, watching the next one. Ethan caught another attacker by the arm before the baton struck. With a sharp shove, he slammed him against the wall and pinned him there. Daniel froze for a second when the last figure raised his blade, but then he moved. He ducked under the first strike and drove his shoulder into the attacker's chest, knocking him off balance. Matthew reached over and finished it with a single, precise strike to the back of the knee. The whole room watched in silence. In less than 30 seconds, all 4 armored figures were on the floor, their weapons scattered. None of them could stand. The humans had not drawn a single weapon. They hadn't even raised their voices. Laura stayed calm. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every delegate who dared to look back. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Whoever sent them," she said, "has their answer." She turned and walked back to her seat. Her team moved behind her, returning to their places as if nothing had happened. Matthew straightened his jacket. Claire adjusted her hair. Ethan crossed his arms. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hands steady now. The president finally stepped forward again. His face was pale, and his voice shook slightly. "Remove them," he ordered. Station guards rushed in and began to drag the defeated attackers out of the room. The delegates stayed quiet. No one spoke. No one even moved until the doors unlocked and the usual noise of the chamber slowly returned. The session continued, but the air had changed completely. No one laughed, no one whispered. Whenever Laura's team moved or shifted, eyes followed them. Later, as they left the chamber and walked back to their suite, Daniel finally spoke. "Was that planned?" he asked. "Of course it was," Matthew said calmly. "Someone wanted to see how far they could push. And now they know," Claire added. "Now they know," Laura repeated softly. When they reached their suite, she sat by the window, looking out at the stars. Below, the station lights glimmered faintly. Behind her, Matthew stood silently, his arms crossed. Ethan leaned against the wall, watching the door. Claire sat with her legs crossed, quiet and thoughtful. Daniel sat down, still breathing deeply but calmer now. After a long silence, Laura spoke. "What they saw today," she said, "they will not forget." Daniel nodded slowly. "They're afraid now," he said. Laura looked out at the stars, her reflection faint in the glass. "Good," she said simply. "Fear is the first step to respect." Matthew gave the smallest of smiles and turned his gaze back to the door. Outside, the stars continued to shine. The station floated quietly in the void, but everyone inside knew the humans were not like anyone else, and no one would ever look at them the same way again. The night after the attack was quiet, but the station was not at rest. Laura stood by the window of her suite, looking out at the endless stars. The lights of ships moved slowly outside, bright specks against the black. She could see her faint reflection in the glass, her face calm but her mind sharp. She knew the council would not stop here. There would be more questions, more challenges. Behind her, Matthew sat at the table with a cup of tea, watching her. Ethan leaned on the wall by the door, arms crossed, his eyes half closed but still alert. Claire sat on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Daniel stood near the corner, quiet but thoughtful. "Tomorrow," Laura said softly, still. Looking outside, "they will ask for answers." Matthew nodded once. "And you'll give them." She turned and looked at him. "Just enough." Daniel finally spoke. "But why not tell them everything? Why not just explain?" Claire smiled faintly. "Because they wouldn't believe it," she said. Ethan added, "And because fear is more useful than trust." For now, Laura walked back to the table and sat down. She opened her folder, though she already knew what was inside. Her notes were ready. Her thoughts were clear. Tomorrow would decide everything. The next morning, the chamber was full, before Laura even arrived. The noise of whispered conversations filled the air, louder than usual. As she walked through the door, the whispers fell quiet. Every pair of eyes turned to her and her team. They moved as they always did, calm, steady, silent. Laura walked ahead, her steps even. Matthew and Ethan followed close behind. Claire and Daniel moved on either side, watching the room carefully. The crowd parted as they passed. Even the guards standing at the walls looked away as the humans walked by. At the center of the room, the president stood waiting. His golden robe shimmered under the lights. His expression was serious, his hands resting on his staff. "Ambassador Banks," he said as she approached, "the council wishes to hear from you today." "Of course," Laura replied calmly. She stopped at her table and set her folder down. Her team stood behind her, quiet as stone. The president raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Many here have witnessed the events of these last days. They have seen your team stop an armed fight, without weapons. They have seen you face trained assassins without armor. They have seen you stand against stronger and faster beings and win." The room stayed silent, but the weight of the words filled the air. "They ask," the president continued, "how? How do humans do this? What is your secret?" Laura looked round the room. She met the eyes of the Tharn envoy, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She saw the Varian delegate glance away when her gaze reached him. Even the guards at the walls stood still, waiting. She spoke slowly, clearly. "There is no secret," she began. "Only history." The room stayed quiet. "We do not bring weapons because we know weapons can be taken. We do not wear armor because armor can fail. We bring what cannot be stolen, what cannot break." She stood taller, her voice steady but firm. "Humans learned long ago that strength is not in the hand, but in the heart. Not in what you hold, but in what you are." The Tharn envoy frowned. "You expect us to believe," he said loudly, "that bare hands and calm minds can defeat blades and rifles?" Laura turned to him, her expression soft but unwavering. "I don't expect you to believe," she said simply. "You already saw it." A ripple of whispers moved through the chamber. The Tharn envoy sat back in his chair, silent now. Laura continued, "Our history is full of war. We have fought in deserts with no water. We have fought in ice with no shelter. We have fought when we were outnumbered, outmatched, and alone. And we survived. We learned that what matters is not what you carry, but what you become." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You ask why humans do not bring weapons," she said. "It is because we are the weapon." Matthew stood, little straighter at her words. Claire's faint smile returned. Ethan's hands relaxed behind his back. "Daniel,"